Good evening. This is Mitch Wagner, City Manager of Guymon, and it is my privilege to introduce the Guernsey Engineering and Design firm that we have brought in to do our streetscape project here on Main Street. So with that, I will turn it over to them and let them introduce themselves.
Good evening. It's been a fun process. We've worked a couple days on a streetscape project. A little bit about the project team. Guernsey Engineering out of Oklahoma City is the lead on it, and we have Meg Nayland with Nayland Planning that's helping us out, and Hans Bootzer with Bootzer Architecture. And for the last couple days we've been here, we've interviewed staff, citizens. We walked around and talked to some of the business owners to get a feel of what they're thinking, and so we did that. We had a charrette last night with the public to gather some ideas and some visioning, and then today we started to get some things down on paper, some concepts, and we're going to present those and some real basic ideas of kind of some direction of where we think we will go. So with that, I will turn it over to Meg to kind of go through some of the options.
Sure. So we heard a lot last night, and as Darren mentioned, all through the day, that let me get this microphone a little closer to me. So we heard a lot yesterday, throughout the day and into the evening, ideas that people have for not just what they expect their streetscape to look like, but how they expect to use their streets within downtown and what some of those changes might look like. So hearing all of that, we looked at the overall study area, which goes from Highway 54 all the way over to Highway 64, which is also 12th Street. And we're focused mainly on Main Street, but because of the two parallel streets, Ellison and Quinn, and how these land uses all relate to each other, we looked a little bit beyond and took into consideration the side streets. And we did focus on what we call the core area, which is really around 5th Street and 4th Street because of the concentration of commercial uses right there, as well as the brick streets that people are so familiar with. And so a lot of what you're going to see in these next few slides are options for the way that the streetscape could be addressed along Main Street. So we're calling that particular area Type 1. So we're looking at 4 options for the segment of Main Street that is between 4th and 5th, and then the two, I guess all the way up to 6th and down to 3rd. You'll see some other labels on there. Type 2 are the side streets. Type 3 would be the parallel streets of Ellison and Quinn. And then as we get more input from the community, that will influence how we think about other segments that are within this overall study area. So again, we're focused on Type 1 this evening and a little bit of Type 2. So that's a close-up of that. You can see Main Street running from left to right there. And right there in the middle between 4th and 5th is the American Theater. That marquee, we think, is a pretty cool feature in your streetscape and something to be highlighted, and a key element to always make a focal point within your streetscape. So just looking at what we're calling Type 1, this is a quick sketch on basically your cross-section. The laser doesn't show up in this screen, but this is a cross-section. The heavier lines on the top and bottom of the page would be your building edges. So everything you're seeing illustrated in between, we're taking full advantage of that space on the street that is face of building to face of building. And so this is essentially option 1, keeping your current cross-section intact. The kinds of things we're suggesting here are ways to introduce some landscaping, and those would be taking some of the parallel spaces and bringing that curb out to the travel lane where you have some opportunity to plant some trees and give some more canopy to the street. You're also seeing those at the corners, options there to be able to anchor that. In all of these options, we are suggesting that we do what's called bump outs or bulb outs, and it's a way of bringing the curb line out closer to the center lines of the street so that you're actually making those crosswalks shorter and making it safer for pedestrians or easier for pedestrians to get from one side of the street to the other. And so in those cases, you're actually seeing that pulled out. In some cases, you're going from a 50-foot crosswalk that you have today and dropping to 33 feet or less. So it gives you some savings in that distance, but also gives you that room for landscaping. If you're wondering what that feature is in the center, that's taking that area that's currently striped in gold paint and suggesting a very short median, and we call them pedestrian refuges. It's just a place where a pedestrian can cross mid-block, get to that midpoint, and with a landscape median, have a place to be able to actually stop and look at the direction of traffic coming the other way and continue on across. So they're not out there floundering in the middle of the street with traffic coming from either direction. So those are fairly minimal changes to make it more pedestrian friendly and introduce more landscaping. You're keeping roughly the same parking spaces that you have out there today with a couple of exceptions. So we think in our counts we are losing a couple spaces. And here's some illustrations of what those really look like on the ground. The one on the left is more diagrammatic. The one on the right is an actual constructed street cross section, so you can see how the pedestrian movement is facilitated with that short median. Second option also indicates the idea that you would convert that striped section to a median, still with the changes to the corners so that you have the shortened crosswalks and easier movement. The turn lanes are still in place. And here we are looking at ways of just trying to grab some of those parking spaces and at an equal spacing, respecting where the lighting is that has gone on down the street. We're doing that in all cases. But it's an alternating pattern with the street trees and the lighting, and it's a way to introduce trees as an alternative to those canopies. It may be that as we study this further, you may be able to have a combination of canopy and street tree, but those parallel spaces converted actually helps create those spaces for street tree planting. Third option, some of those same characteristics are here. The lights are maintained. The new crosswalks at the intersections are maintained. We're also showing a mid-block cross-section here. But the biggest difference is the traffic counts we're looking at may not warrant these turning lanes onto their side streets. And if you were able to convert back to a 2-lane street without the turn lanes, that gives you ample room to have parallel parking on one side and angled parking on the other to increase your on-street parking. And at the same time as you do that, you're introducing some places where some landscaping can occur. And then finally, the last option, we heard a lot from folks last night about being able to slow down traffic, make it even more pedestrian friendly, and find ways to introduce landscaping, some street furnishings. Maybe it's places for outdoor dining associated with the restaurants that are along the street or will be in the future. And this is a combination where you see parallel parking, you see the angled parking. Again, the turn lanes are gone, which is where you're getting that space to create this. But you also should notice a shift. So as you leave one intersection, you're more towards what's actually the east side of the street, the top of the top building. And then mid-block, the traffic would shift, and you'd actually be driving closer to the buildings on the south side, or it's actually the west side of the street. And that shift actually goes a long way to slowing traffic down. That in combination with introducing the vertical landscaping and some other elements also causes people to slow down. So those pieces are there as well. That's something that we have seen executed well in other cities. This is about a 6-block area in Hendersonville, North Carolina. And we show you this because they did it years ago, and it's grown in and it's really gotten established. So you can kind of see, if you look closely from block to block, how it shifts. So as you go through the intersection, you're not shifting. It all happens at the mid-block point. And so here's what that looks like close up. And the advantage there is there are alternating sides where you've created space for angled parking, but you've also created space for seating, for landscaping. So people actually come out here and hang out on the street. They'll get an ice cream cone, they'll get food takeout from some of the restaurants and enjoy just sitting on the street and people watching and just being part of that whole scene. So we think you've got room to do that if some of those turn lanes go away, to be able to change those curb lines and start to have some of those spaces for a better experience along that street. And one of the reasons that we want to promote that, whether it's this form or one of the others, giving people a reason to be out on the street and enjoying the outdoors. When people see people and that activity on the street, it's a magnet for other people, and that's good for business. So from an economic development standpoint, when you can create these active streets where people are just enjoying being there, more people want to be there as well. So this is a close-up of one of those intersections I was describing. So again, we're not talking about dramatic changes, but just pinching those corners in a bit and making those crosswalks shorter. That's where you stand to gain. The one, yes?
I was wondering if I could ask a question. We've got great light standards downtown, not only throughout the corridor, but they're very highway oriented. You know, they're the high, closer to a Cobra head design. Has there been any thought put more towards a pedestrian scale light fixture that might kind of warm it up and make that a little friendlier? I mean, like you said, they're great lights that are down there, but they're just way up there and they're not down at the level where people are.
Right. And we see that a lot, you know, that happens first, and then, so sometimes the obvious answer for some folks is to go in and with an alternating fixture, add additional lighting here, because you have so much lighting. That might not be what you want to do, but as we go through this further, and you guys may want to jump in, but sometimes the more landscape level lighting and uplighting of the landscape you introduce or other vertical features might actually add that layer of lighting that starts to highlight the things that are that pedestrian scale. So you accomplish it with lighting, but it's in a different form.
Maybe
So
lighted bollards or something a little like that's a good idea.
or, yeah, right, a lot of different forms, but that's something we can look at as well. The side street, where the brick streets are, 4th and 5th, we looked at that, and in your comprehensive plan, there is a suggestion for accommodating bike and pedestrian movement on one or more of those streets. And so that cross-section actually, because of the current vehicular lanes, you've got a 14-foot width from center line to the edge of your parallel parking. You can actually keep your current cross-section where your parallel spaces are and introduce, what you're really doing is changing the pavement markings to really highlight where an obvious bike lane would be. So with the enhancements to your actual pedestrian paths that are your sidewalks and the introduction of striping that delineates the bike lanes, you can accomplish some of what you're describing in your comprehensive plan, and you're calling it out, I believe, as complete streets in some instances. So being able to accomplish that, we think you have that width there to do that. So that's what's illustrated and indicated with those dimensional lines across the bottom. Do y'all have anything to add? Any of that? Okay. So that's a very messy sketch of the same thing. So you can kind of see the on-street parking, the two cars driving in either direction in the center. Very skinny bikers in between them. And sidewalks with no pedestrians yet. So now there's plenty of details that we have contemplated that Hans is going to talk about that have a more architectural component to them.
Yeah, so one of the the questions that we had was, based on feedback in our community conversations over the last few days, there are people who really enjoy what the awnings out front on some of the buildings actually achieve for us in terms of shade, more pedestrian-friendly scale, helping control a little bit of the wind. And so one of the options that we offer is the idea that, could we actually design an awning that is applied to the buildings over this 2 to 3 block zone of the core of Main Street, and that it's something that's specifically designed for downtown Guymon, And that would then bring a little bit of a sense of intention to the awning elements. They could also provide additional downlighting, place for a system of signage that makes wayfinding a little bit easier, makes it easier for the various stores to advertise and so forth. So we just offer this option, as something to consider. And there's some, really beautiful precedents, especially through the southern half of the United States, the South and the Southwest, for these types of awnings that, really look intentional, that and they're carefully designed. And so here are a couple, a series of images from Galveston, Texas, specifically the Strand, where you see signage, again, similar to what Meg was talking about earlier, giving a greater sense of intentionally creating places for people to hang out, tables and chairs, benches, signage to invite people into the stores and so forth. Here on the left, you see again, creating that sense of intention with designed signage. And it's certainly at night, those kind of arcade zones, really can become something special for evening lighting. And then here are a couple images also from the French Quarter in New Orleans. Again, the same type of idea, and could also become a place for, with those buildings where we have 2 stories on our main street here in Guymon, maybe those become balconies, or places for planting or other fanfare, flags, and so forth to celebrate different holidays in the communities. And then we offered the idea, based on some of the earlier suggestions about streetscape and adding some trees at the crosswalk. Here you see how these added street trees and these intentional arcade structures can coexist. When we start to talk about specific street trees, Darren here has a few thoughts to share.
Yeah, when you take a look at street trees, you want to make sure that the size is appropriate, the width. Trees have different canopy structures, so sometimes they can grow wide, some of them grow narrow. So when you have a limited space from the building face out, you want to make sure that that's not going to grow too wide. So these are a few examples of trees that work well, that are tough trees that can survive the urban environment in a downtown, but also have the form that works well with the sidewalks and the buildings. So those are some things to think about, and we understand the challenges of blocking signage and that kind of thing, and bird issues with dense trees. So the selection and placement of the trees will be carefully thought out as we go through the process to make sure they work well. And then as we work through, there was some discussion about lighting and about the scale of the tall vehicular lighting, and then not so much of the pedestrian scale. So what are some things you can do to kind of bring that level down a little bit? These are some festoon style lighting that you can string across the street that kind of give that old ambiance, I guess. And there's a lot of cool designs that you can do with it. These are some fairly elaborate ideas, but there's also just the standard strung lights that do create that festive feel and a pedestrian scale that provides that nice soft lighting that you want in that area.
And then we've also been looking at, the gateway conditions to Main Street. Again, as to the south, you have South 2nd Street, and northern edge, you have 12th Street, and what might be something that really gives a sense of celebration to those thresholds as people move into downtown. And again, we look at some examples that have been built in other places. Galveston, years ago, built these gateways. They invited famous architects from across the world, actually, to design gateways, which they constructed. Some of them still stand today, but they just kind of, give you a sense of threshold, sense of celebration, and a sense of, defining the edges of this very special Main Street district. And then lastly, a lot of conversation, a lot of feedback from the community has also circled on the question of, can we have somewhere carve out for ourselves what we're going to call a civic green. And when you see the image up here on the screen, you see that green square, that gives you a rough idea of, what we believe proportionately would be an appropriate size for this part of Guymon's Main Street. And so we just, we're not here to start telling you where, this could go, but more importantly, just giving a sense of magnitude. And there are some fantastic examples across the United States and more beyond that just give you a sense of, what it can do for a community when you have that civic green where, people can commune and celebrate. You have bands set up, a band shell, but it really has this chameleon-like quality that, throughout the different times of year, different activities can take place. You can have, oversized chess or checkers out there, places for formal music as well as informal. Someone can just set up, a little amplifier and a guitar and just start playing. And then this is, lastly, again, ideally you find a space, a town green or civic green that allows for a restaurant to set up and define an edge to that town green so that maybe people can just naturally spill outside and help activate that green space in the heart of downtown Guymon. Of course, proposals like this can only succeed if you have, these key components to see it through. And most importantly, and what we're seeing so much of over the last few days is strong leadership. It's leadership at the city level, overall just community activists. People are just generally passionate about downtown Guymon, businesses along with the Chamber of Commerce, property owners, and of course, your Main Street operations. There are certain adjustments that can take place with regards to our policy or zoning initiatives that really needs to be looked at in order to open the door for some of the types of activities and uses that could help add richer layers of activity here on Main Street. Design matters. Some of the examples that we've just shown you from within the state of Oklahoma or across the region or across the world. And then lastly, funding, right? What are those key sources, whether they're locally generated, regional, state, or federal sources that can help make this happen. So with that, we turn it back to the community for the much needed feedback and dialogue. Thank you very much.